Welcome back. And to continue the conversation on the interrelated challenge of climate and biodiversity, I am delighted to be joined by our two next guests. Professor Johan Rockström, who is the Professor of Earth System Science and the Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and David Cooper, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we're delighted that David's been able to join us, having just arrived back from Kunming in China, where he was putting forward the work on COP15. And with that, I'm going to hand over to David and Johan to take the conversation forward. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. And yes, as you say, we're dealing here in COP26 with implementing the strong agreements made in Paris, and we're also developing through the COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention a parallel agreement to put nature on a path to recovery by 2030. Johan, how are these two issues interrelated? Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, I think this conversation right now is really at the heart of delivering on the Paris Agreement, because we have so much scientific evidence. In fact, it's an unequivocal confidence level on the fact that if we do not, manage nature for resilience and for life support, we will fail even on Paris. We know that 56% of the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel burning are being sequestered by intact ecosystems on land and in the ocean. This is just a proof of a phenomenal resilience of the Earth system, because we've transformed almost half of terrestrial ecosystems on land into human-dominated landscapes that are actually emitting greenhouse gases. So it's just the half that remains, which is intact, the biodiversity-rich habitats on land and the functioning marine systems in the ocean that are still kind of performing this tremendous task for us. So in a way, you could say that Kunming holds the final key for success in Paris or Glasgow. But how do you feel? I mean, so that's why I'm so curious to hear you coming back from Kunming. What's the atmosphere there, and are you making progress? Because, we've been struggling for such a long time of not having the 1.5 degrees Celsius equivalent for nature, and you're kind of leading the pathway there.
So the post-2020 framework it's still being negotiated. It will be presented and discussed and finalized and adopted at the second part of the COP15, which will take place in April, May next year, also in Kunming. What this first part did was set the scene and try and give some political direction to this final stage of negotiations. Ministers at the high-level segment adopted the Kunming Declaration, which recognized, firstly, that biodiversity loss, climate change and other threats are major crises that are actually existential threats to our society, to our prosperity, and then called for a post-2020 framework that is sufficiently ambitious to bend the curve of biodiversity loss this decade. So just as under the Climate Convention, we're seeing, yes, long-term goals for 2050, but a focus on action now by 2030, this decade. Similarly, under the Biodiversity Convention, there's increasingly a recognition that the crucial decade for action is this one. We need to take action this decade to reverse the loss of biodiversity, put it on a path to recovery by 2030.
And I find this to be, it's so promising to hear that we're making progress here, because, as you know, we have so much science now showing that the big living ecosystems on planet Earth are holding irrecoverable carbon to begin with in terms of stocks, but they're also providing the living dynamics of not only filtering water and oxygen and all the ecosystem services, but also keeping the carbon cycle intact, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, nitrous oxide, water, all of them being part of the greenhouse gas dynamics. So keeping them on the right side from tipping points to avoid that the rainforests tip over to savannas, to avoid that permafrost thaws more and more rapidly and irreversibly is so fundamental for the stability of the climate system. So, I'm curious to hear a little bit on, 2 days back here in Glasgow, there was the over 100 countries making their statements to halt deforestation by 2030. My spontaneous reaction to that was really promising that Glasgow really does what it set out to do. Actually, the UK government really set out to enable this to be the first climate COP to also integrate nature. Halting deforestation by 2030 seems, at first sight, really important. Is it, in your view, significant enough? Is it fast enough? Is it large enough spatially, geographically? Are we missing something here? I mean, from a Kunming perspective, so to say, how would you value that statement?
Well, I mean, firstly, we certainly very much welcome the increased focus under this convention on nature, on the role that biodiversity, the role ecosystems can play in addressing the climate challenge, both mitigation and adaptation, and also recognition that climate change is already impacting biodiversity, and you really need to focus on 1.5 degrees. The impacts at 2 degrees would be at least twice as bad for biodiversity as the impacts on 1.5 degrees. So we really, I think, have to create a virtuous circle here where we're investing in ecosystem-based approaches to address climate change. But these must not replace greenhouse gas emissions. They must not merely offset greenhouse gas emissions. They must be in addition to strong reductions in greenhouse gas emissions so that we can stay to 1.5 and so that resilience of the ecosystems that you talk about is maintained and that nature can continue to provide those services.
Well, this is one of the things I find to be one of the biggest risks with the whole voluntary offsetting markets and nature offsetting, that we tend to forget that, when the IPCC runs all the climate models, that gives us a safe landing around 1.5, which translates to a 2/3 chance of having a global carbon budget of roughly 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining to be burned from fossil fuels. We tend to forget that the only reason we get that budget, that remaining budget, is the assumption in all the models that the capacity of thriving biodiverse rich ecosystems is maintained, that the carbon sinks and stocks are still performing over the next half of this century. So of course, you're right, our only chance is to certainly have nature-based solutions, native climate solutions. It must be accelerating very fast and be scaled, but they cannot be used to replace the decarbonization pathway on fossil fuels, which is a tendency among some companies using this as a kind of a greenwashing measure, and that is something. I mean, somehow we have to tidy that up.
Yeah, that's right. As some have said, net zero is not zero. We certainly need targets for net zero, but these additional mechanisms through using ecosystems must be that, and they must be additional. And we also have to recognise that, for example, the absorption of CO2 and heat by the oceans, for instance, isn't cost-free. I mean, this is already
has tremendous negative impacts,
causing warming, low in oxygen, ocean acidification. So it's really important that we double down on both on emission reductions and on nature-based solutions. It's also really important that we do this in an ecologically literate way. It's not just about planting trees. It's also about protecting all types of ecosystems and being conscious about how restoration is done, for instance. And of course, it's essential that we listen to the voices and hear the voices of local communities, and particularly of indigenous peoples, that there isn't a sort of tsunami of climate finance that overrides their rights. Obviously, we want to see more finance going into these mechanisms, but it must not be at the cost of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And of course, it must not be at the cost of food security either.
But what do you see in terms of financial mechanisms? What are the discussions now in the CBD? I mean, is it an equivalent discussion as in the climate side on the Green Climate Fund and trying to get the billions, potentially even trillions, on the table for investing in in integrity and intelligence?
I mean, perhaps the best estimates are, a finance gap of some 700 billion, give or take a few billion.
Yeah, let's make it a trillion.
And we're going to need new resources, but perhaps the lowest hanging fruit and the most important thing to do is to stop financing the destruction of nature through the perverse subsidies that we have. So the greater part of reducing that financing gap can probably be obtained by decreasing those subsidies and repurposing them. We also need to look and build on the success that has been in the climate world in getting all finance aligned not only with climate goals, but also with goals to reduce biodiversity loss. So the work of the TFND that we heard about earlier today, for instance, is important in this regard. And in fact, Elizabeth Moremma, the Executive Secretary, co-chairs that with David Craig, who we heard from a little while ago.
So just in a final note, I mean, do you foresee through the Kunming process that we will be able to get a science-based set of targets, quantitative targets, equivalent to the 1.5 degrees Celsius for biodiversity, both intact and maintaining integrity, or do you foresee that that's a too big ask at this point?
So I think, currently we're looking at 4 major goals. One looking at species and ecosystems, one looking at nature's contributions to people, one looking at benefit sharing, and one looking at finance.
Yeah, okay.
And then, of course, and there'll be multiple actions needed to achieve those goals. And I think one challenge now will be making sure that, again, those actions that are needed this decade are commensurate with the goals that are set for the longer term.
Yeah. No, but great. I am quite encouraged by the fact that we're seeing more and more integration between the climate and the biodiversity agenda. I mean, we've been calling for this since we published the Planetary Boundary Framework actually in 2009, the need for a whole Earth system approach for stewardship across every element of the planetary boundaries. So this is the direction of travel that we need. So great.
Yeah, now let's hope the negotiators deliver the goods.
Exactly, let's hope that. That's what we must support as much as we ever can. Good, thanks a lot.